You probably have heard of the South China Sea disputes, a major flashpoint involving China, the Philippines, Vietnam, and others. But the South China Sea isn't the only maritime dispute in Asia. Today, we're going to talk about 4 other maritime flashpoints in East Asia and how they are reshaping the geopolitical landscape today. Everyone knows about Taiwan and the South China Sea. We're looking at other disputes that haven't appeared in headlines lately. Which ones have you heard of? Leave a comment below. Stay tuned, because we're ranking them in order, from the least likely to spark an actual shooting war to the highest risk of conflict. First up, Dokdo Takeshima. This dispute centers on a group of islets in the ocean between Japan and South Korea. Korea administers the islands, which it calls Dokdo. Japan calls them Takeshima and insists it is the rightful owner. Sometimes they're also called the Liancour Rocks. We have to call them something. For the purposes of this video, we're going to use the names preferred by the country that actually controls the disputed islands. So in this case, Dokdo. There's no permanent population on the islands, but South Korea does maintain a rotating group of about 25 administrative staff there, mostly to reinforce its claim. And about 500 tourists visit Dokdo each day, again, motivated by the patriotic desire to proclaim this is Korean land. The Dokdo Islands have been disputed between Japan and Korea since the late 1800s, but the dispute was temporarily rendered moot when Japan seized control of all of Korea in 1910. Japan ruled the Korean peninsula and its islands, including Dokdo, as a colony from 1910 until the empire's defeat in World War II. After 1945, Japan renounced sovereignty over its occupied territories, including Korea. But the tiny islands weren't specifically named in the official list of territories that Japan was ceding control over. Tokyo insists that its claim to the islands is separate from its colonial rule over Korea, and thus didn't end with World War II. South Korea believes Dokdo is its inherent territory, and it administers de facto control over the islets. Japan disagrees and insists on its claim to the islands. Tokyo has even suggested international arbitration to settle the issue. You may be thinking, who really cares which country controls a bunch of uninhabited islands in the middle of the sea? But Japan and Korea both care, a lot. Dokdo is a deeply emotional issue for many Koreans especially. The tiny and uninhabited islands are important not for themselves but for what they represent: national pride, a rich fishing ground, and potential deposits of natural gas. For Japan and South Korea, which are heavily dependent on imported LNG, the prospect of their own exploitable reserves is extremely attractive. And for Koreans, Dokdo was the first territory seized by Japan during its colonization of Korea. The islands are seen as a symbol of Korea's right to self-rule, and Japan's continued claim is read as neo-imperialism. The dispute has sparked immense bad blood in the past. In 2006, Korea sent 20 gunboats to the area to prevent Japan from carrying out a maritime survey. In 2012, South Korea's President Lee Myung-bak visited the islands. Japan withdrew its ambassador from South Korea in response. In 2018, as the world celebrated the inter-Korean team at the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, Japan was furious over Korea's unified Olympic flag. The flag showed the Dokdo Islands outlined in blue alongside the Korean peninsula. Korea was forced to change the flag, removing the outline of the islands to comply with the International Olympic Committee's ban on political statements. And yet the anger remains mostly rhetorical. The chances of Japan and South Korea actually coming to blows over Dokdo is almost non-existent. Both are U.S. allies, and since the end of World War II, they have been effectively on the same side, first of the Cold War, and now the new Cold War between China and the United States. Those geopolitical considerations motivate Japan and South Korea to tamp down on tensions over Dokdo. For example, in the 1965 treaty that normalized relations, Japan and South Korea effectively agreed to shelve the dispute. Each side retained its claim, but agreed not to force the issue. Today, the Dokdo issue is more or less shelved again, as Japan and South Korea turn toward each other for stability in an uncertain world. But it could rise again anytime a Korean or Japanese politician feels the need to drum up nationalist sentiment. That's why the Dokdo issue is so important. Not because it could spark a war, but because it could derail the tentative steps to finally build a solid relationship between Japan and South Korea. That relationship, in turn, is crucial to U.S. plans to keep China's influence in check. In other words, these tiny, uninhabited islands could complicate the competition between superpowers. The next dispute involves Russia and Japan, and it also has roots in World War II. In fact, these disputed islands are the reason the war technically never ended between Russia and Japan. The two countries to this day haven't signed a peace treaty formalizing the end of World War II over 80 years ago. These are the Kuril Islands, or as Japan calls them, the Northern Territories. Unlike the other disputed islands in this video, these 4 islands countries do have a sizable civilian population, around 20,000 Russians altogether. The problem is that they used to have a large population of Japanese residents, until they were forced out of their homes by the invading Soviet army in the closing days of World War II. Japan has never accepted the conquest. Let's rewind for a second. In 1855, Japan and Russia signed the Treaty of Shimoda, establishing their first official border. The treaty recognized Japanese sovereignty over the 4 southernmost Kuril Islands, Etorufu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and the Habomai Islets. 20 years later, the Treaty of St. Petersburg granted Japan the rest of the Kuril chain in exchange for Russia gaining full control of Sakhalin Island. Ownership shifted back and forth with the tides of war over the years, but the ultimate breaking point came at the end of World War II. In February 1945, at the Yalta Conference, Allied leaders secretly agreed to hand over the entire Kuril chain to the Soviet Union as an incentive for Joseph Stalin to declare war on Imperial Japan. In August 1945, just days before Japan's formal surrender, Soviet troops invaded and occupied the 4 southern Kurils. Overnight, the Soviet Union annexed the territory, expelling more than 17,000 Japanese residents and replacing them with Soviet citizens. In the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty, a defeated Japan officially renounced all rights and claims to the Kuril Islands. However, Tokyo argues that the 4 southernmost islands were never historically part of the Kuril chain mentioned in the treaty. Furthermore, the Soviet Union walked out of negotiations and never actually signed the San Francisco Treaty. So, Tokyo argues that Moscow has no valid international claim to the southern Kurils. There was a brief glimmer of hope in 1956. The Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration restored diplomatic relations, and Moscow actually agreed to return the 2 smallest islands, Shikotan and Habomai, after a formal peace treaty was signed. However, amid intense Cold War pressures and the formalization of the US-Japan security alliance, the treaty was never finalized, and so all 4 islands remained firmly in Soviet and later Russian hands. For decades, Japan has used diplomacy and economic incentives to cozy up to Russia, hoping to at least secure the return of Shikotan and Habomai, as the Soviets had promised. Former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo spent years building a personal rapport with Russian President Vladimir Putin, offering massive economic investments on the islands in hopes of a breakthrough. But that didn't lead to any concrete results. Today, Japan has stopped trying to make nice with Russia. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Japan aligned firmly with its G7 partners, slapping heavy economic sanctions on Moscow. In doing so, Tokyo knew that it was giving up any hope of ever seeing the Kurils fly a Japanese flag again. Sure enough, Russia unilaterally walked away from the peace treaty negotiations. Worse, Moscow permanently revoked a long-standing agreement that had allowed elderly former Japanese residents of the Kuril Islands to visit their ancestral graves without needing a Russian visa. Moscow also tore up a bilateral fishing agreement dating from 1998. Russia occasionally detains or even fires on Japanese fishing vessels operating in the island's waters. Putin has also fortified the Kuril Islands with advanced S-300 air defense systems, alongside Bal and Bastion anti-ship missiles capable of targeting vessels all the way down to Hokkaido. Live-fire military exercises on the islands are now a regular, tense occurrence. Each military activity sends a message to Japan. These islands are ours, and we'll defend them with force. That said, we're unlikely to see the Kuril Islands spark a full-blown conflict. While Moscow has shot at and even killed Japanese fishermen in the past, Japan is not likely to send its Navy or Coast Guard to try and re-establish control. Its approach has been strictly diplomatic for decades. But that doesn't mean we can ignore this flashpoint. Like the Dokdo issue, it has the potential to reshape the borders of geopolitical competition in East Asia, especially given the growing military cooperation between China and Russia. The next dispute on our list, though, does have the potential to explode into direct conflict between the claimants. Surprise, surprise, it's yet another dispute involving Japan, and like the Dokdo dispute, this one is linked to Japan's colonial past. This next dispute centers on a group of uninhabited islands in the East China Sea. They are about 330 kilometers east of the Chinese mainland, 170 kilometers north of Taiwan, and 410 kilometers west of Okinawa Prefecture in Japan. All 3 governments, China, Taiwan, and Japan, claim them. Japan calls them the Senkaku Islands, China the Diaoyu Islands, and Taiwan the Diaoyu Tai. The islands are administered by Japan, but China has been increasingly aggressive about staking its claim. Like most of the disputes we've discussed today, this dispute is a piece of unresolved history left over from World War II. Japan has controlled the Senkaku since the late 1800s. That much everyone agrees on. The key point here is how Japan came to control them in the first place. Tokyo claims that the islands were terra nullius, meaning they were not under any state's control when it annexed them. But China and Taiwan consider the Senkakus to have been under control of the Qing dynasty in the 1800s, only to be ceded to Japan after the First Sino-Japanese War ended in 1895. The Treaty of Shimonoseki required China to cede Taiwan and its associated islands to Japan. The big question is whether the Senkakus were included in that group. This matters because after World War II, Japan was required to give Taiwan and those unnamed associated islands back to China. Both China and Taiwan argue that handover should have included the Senkaku Islands, but that never happened. The U.S. had de facto control of the islands during its lengthy occupation of Okinawa Prefecture. After the U.S. handed control of Okinawa back to Tokyo in 1972, Japan inherited control over the Senkakus as well. Washington has been careful to state that it doesn't take a position on who the rightful owner of the islands really is. Like many of these disputes, control over the Senkakus is not really about the islands themselves. First, there's the history. Many in China see Japan's continued control of the Senkakus as a historical wrong to be righted. When Japan's national government purchased 3 of the islands in 2012, it sparked massive, sometimes violent protests outside the Japanese embassy and consulates in China. Even though Japan bought the islands to prevent them from being sold to an ultra-nationalist who would almost certainly have rubbed the dispute in China's face. Beyond national pride, there's the practical impact. Controlling the islands means controlling the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone around the islands, which grants exclusive rights to maritime resources in that zone. Most obviously, that means fishing rights. But there's also suspected to be significant oil and gas reserves nearby. In 1969, a geological survey by the UN suggested the continental shelf northeast of Taiwan, in other words, the area of the Senkaku Islands, could hold some of the world's most prolific oil and gas reserves. It's no coincidence that China and Taiwan first began voicing their objection to Japan's administration of the islands in the early 1970s. Japan and Taiwan agreed to share fishing rights near the Senkakus in a 2014 agreement. Since then, they've effectively shelved their dispute. The two are otherwise friendly towards each other and apparently see little point in jeopardizing cooperation over the islands. China is another story. Beijing has been stepping up its presence near the Senkakus, sending more and more vessels closer and closer to the islands. Last year, according to the Japan Coast Guard, China's own Coast Guard came within 24 nautical miles of the Senkakus on 357 out of 365 days. That was the highest figure since Japan began tracking such incursions in 2008. China also set a record for the number of vessels sent that close to the Senkakus, with 1,380 ships involved. And China keeps breaking those records every year. 2024 set a new high, until China upped the ante in 2025. China's near-constant presence in the area has Japan worried that Beijing is moving to consolidate de facto control over the Senkakus. So far, the dispute hasn't escalated into the use of force, but there's not much further China can push the envelope short of actually entering the island's territorial sea, at which point Tokyo will be forced to respond. And the US government has explicitly said its defense treaty with Japan covers the Senkaku Islands. In other words, these tiny islands with a population of 0 could spark a China-US war. And yet, the Senkaku question still isn't the riskiest maritime dispute in East Asia. That distinction goes to the only flashpoint that's actually seen military action and casualties in this century. And yet, weirdly, it's often overlooked. I'm talking about the maritime border between North and South Korea. You surely have heard of the 38th parallel. That's the line that effectively divides the Korean peninsula into North Korea and South Korea. It's surrounded to the north and south by a heavily fortified area called, a bit ironically, the demilitarized zone. But at least both sides accept the DMZ as the de facto border. That's not the case with the line dividing the two Koreas' holdings in the Yellow Sea. Instead, we have the Northern Limit Line, or NLL. It is a heavily disputed maritime boundary. For decades, these waters have been the site of deadly naval conflicts, including an outright attack by North Korea on South Korean submariners and civilians in 2010. We'll get back to the near war in a second. First, let's go over where the NLL came from in the first place. It was 1953, and the Korean War was drawing to a close. The Armistice Agreement successfully established a land border, today's DMZ, but the negotiators completely failed to agree on a maritime boundary. To prevent South Korean forces from sailing too far north and inadvertently restarting the war, the US-led United Nations Command drew a unilateral line in the sea. Essentially, they extended the 38th parallel west into the Yellow Sea, but instead of going straight, it curves northward toward North Korea to carve out for South Korea control of various islands in the area. This became the Northern Limit Line, literally the northern limit for South Korean sailors and fishermen. Today, Seoul views the NLL as the de facto maritime border. For South Korea, enforcing the NLL is critical for protecting its sovereign territory, including 5 strategic border islands situated right off North Korea's coast. The most notable of these holdings are the Yeonpyeong Islands, located just across the NLL, about 12 kilometers south of North Korea's Hwanghae province. Around 17,000 South Koreans live in these islands, most of them on Yeonpyeong Island itself. Remember that name, you'll be hearing it again soon. North Korea completely rejects the NLL, calling it an illegal and lawless line drawn without its consent. They claim a maritime boundary must further south past the South Korean-held border islands. And North Korea is also not afraid to press its claims with force. That's what makes this particular dispute the most dangerous maritime flashpoint in all of East Asia. The dispute over both ocean and islands has repeatedly spilled into bloodshed. Deadly naval skirmishes erupted in 1999 and 2002 during the lucrative blue crab fishing seasons. In both instances, later dubbed the First Battle of Yeonpyeong and the Second Battle of Yeonpyeong, North Korean fishermen crossed the NLL accompanied by North Korean patrol boats. In the ensuing gunfights, the South Korean Navy drove the North Koreans back across the NLL, but not without a cost. Around 45 North Koreans died in the 2 battles, along with at least 6 South Koreans. But that was nothing compared to 2010, when tensions soared to the brink of an all-out war. On March 26th of that year, a North Korean torpedo sank a South Korean warship, the Cheonan, which was operating near the NLL. The Cheonan sank, killing 46 sailors. Months later, in November 2010, North Korea launched a shocking artillery barrage directly onto Yeonpyeong Island, killing both military personnel and civilians. South Korea retaliated with its own artillery fire, targeting the North Korean rocket launchers. All told, it's estimated that around 15 people were killed on both sides. And things could have been much worse. Robert Gates, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense at the time, said the South Korean government had planned a massive military response that would have included airstrikes on North Korean soil. According to Gates, he and President Obama had to talk Seoul out of escalating the conflict into a full-blown war. While no incident along the NLL since 2010 has come close to matching those tensions, the conflict hasn't disappeared. In 2024, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un officially abandoned the goal of peaceful reunification, legally declaring South Korea a hostile state. He's now taking steps to further fortify and militarize the border, including in the Yellow Sea. Kim specifically ordered his military to adopt a firmer posture along the NLL. In 2024, he warned that if South Korea violates even 0.001 millimeters of North Korea's claimed waters, it would be considered a war provocation. And Kim is taking steps to back up his rhetoric. The Navy has long been considered the weakest branch of the North Korean military, but under Kim, the military is pursuing an aggressive naval buildup. That means a navy with bigger, more capable, and nuclear-armed ships. In June 2026, North Korea commissioned the Choi-hun, a powerful 5,000-ton class destroyer. At the time, Kim openly declared that the North Korean Navy is transitioning into a force equipped with strategic nuclear weapons capable of preemptive first strikes. The Choi-hun was deployed to the West Sea Fleet, the North Korean fleet that operates around and sometimes across the NLL. South Korea isn't standing still either. In October 2025, President Lee Jae-myung achieved a long-held goal, getting U.S. approval for South Korea to develop its own nuclear-powered submarines. These won't be nuclear-armed. South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons, but it's a giant leap in terms of capability. Nuclear subs can travel further and are harder to detect than conventional diesel-electric vehicles. And we can expect those subs to prowl the waters near the NLL alongside a growing number of North Korean submarines. Just like in the case of the Senkakus, the more vessels from each side in a disputed area, the higher risk of a deadly mishap. The difference between the Senkakus and the NLL is that North Korea, unlike China, has repeatedly proved itself willing to use deadly force to press its claims. And also unlike China, North Korea has specifically carved out space for using nuclear weapons in a first strike. That means a fishing dispute near the NLL could spiral into a nuclear escalation. An incident like the Qiunan sinking and the Yongpyong shelling of 2010 would be vastly more dangerous today. Back then, North Korea's nuclear program was still largely a dream. Today, North Korea has a stockpile of nuclear weapons, plus the missiles to launch them, all the way to the US mainland if that's what Kim orders. So amid all the talk of the South China Sea, don't sleep on the disputed maritime border between the two Koreas. This could well be the flashpoint that sparks a major war. The NLL isn't the only overlooked flashpoint in Asia. In fact, we're doing a whole series on Asia's hidden but simmering maritime and territorial disputes. Check back next week for a video on maritime flashpoints in South and Southeast Asia, and which ones are most likely to spark a war. Of course, we've also covered Asia's not-so-overlooked flashpoints in detail, including videos on the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait.